Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Zbigniew Krajewski. In today's considerations, we will try to ask about the truth. And strictly speaking, we are going to ask about everything. About everything what a modern, educated model internet user is afraid to ask about. I'm not afraid to ask questions, but most importantly, I'm not afraid to answer. We will ask about where the universe comes from, if it is possible by logic to find the truth about life, if the science is able to wrong diametrically, what is the purpose of life. We will also ask questions on why we die and why we live. To whom are these considerations directed to? It is first of all for people who are searching. Since in my intellectual searches, I typically came to Christian conclusions. I would like to point out that this thread will appear in the following slides. The key question is not a question about what the facts really are, because we know intuitively what facts are and what interpretations of facts are. What we consider to be facts are not always facts. These are certain interpretations which are influenced by our opinions, unfortunately. Generally speaking, facts are events that we can observe or that have been described by eyewitnesses. All other events are merely subjects of interpretation and therefore cannot be considered facts. We can, however, define certain events as facts, and we can ask about the origin of these facts. Since we have roughly distinguished facts from their interpretations, now we can move on to the next step, which is to identify different scenarios from the source of these facts. As for the facts, we are all convinced that we observe brutal mechanisms of life and death in nature. It doesn't apply only to animals, but people too. Unfortunately, us dying is a fact, no matter how much we would like to postpone that fact into the future. Also, mechanisms of life are extremely brutal, both between animals as well as people, especially among animals, which, from our point of view, we can say are advanced products of bionic engineering. For instance, giraffes, zebras, antelopes, hippos, and so on, which in fact fall victim to predators and are left only to be eaten and digested. In principle, their entire complex life also saturated some functions of the conscious mind that animals possesses, especially the high-functioning ones, as everyone has been convinced by having a cat or dog or other pets at home that they become the source of nutrients for predators in nature. Just like in human world, we do not become the typical object of consumption, although among animals, a hungry lion wouldn't disdain to consume a human as well. Whereas, for sure, our work is often very primitive, exhaustive, giving us not much possibilities for not only a decent life, but development too. Because our brain is, after all, a very advanced unit of signal processing and analyzing. In fact, we are just a cog in a very primitive machine that simply squeezes us like a lemon, preventing us from developing, living, and working, for which normally we have the best predispositions. So we see the brutal mechanisms of life and death. And this particularly applies to the mechanisms in interpersonal relationships. It is not for nothing that the proverb that a man is a wolf to another man came into being. But now we are not merely asking about facts themselves, but about the original sources of these facts. So we will assume here that mechanisms, which I will repeat once again, brutal mechanisms, existed from the very beginning. Of course, it's not a fact, but just assumption that we will construct for the purposes of this slide. We will see the consequences that will arise from this. So we may draw certain conclusion that struggle for existence is a factor which has to cause the transformation of life from very primitive forms to complex ones. Of course, it is a consequence of that because we exist here by some miracle. The assumption is that we have transformed ourselves from very primitive forms to high-functioning forms such as humans. We see the first oval fragment on the diagram. So, as a result of some mechanisms that we assumed have existed from the beginning, and that they are extremely barbaric, then despite everything, they had to lead to producing both high-functioning animal organisms and humans. Now, if we assume that this is what it looks like, what could be the possibilities of the sources of the origin of life? First possibility is the lack of a designer, and here we will follow this red path on the left. So we can accept the concept of the blue box. It is not known where the world comes from or whether it has any purpose, but it exists, and thanks to its brutal forms, it produces and develops life, including conscious life. We can even perform some mathematical models of some hypothetical processes that created the world, but the point is what really led to the directional production of galaxies, planetary systems, and life on Earth. After all, these hypothetical natural processes that create from scratch all the layers of the environment up to the creation of complex life couldn't have emerged by themselves from nothing. There had to be something that, at least initially, set them into motion, with the consequence of precisely chosen goal that led them to complex achievements. In other words, if life on Earth didn't immediately emerge as complex, then it had to additionally develop all these mechanisms of its production. To illustrate the problem with an example, let us assume that a robotic wire factory is operating without human intervention and is only using AI. In a self-modernization process, it will eventually become a factory of humanoid robots. So the question shouldn't be on how the wire transformed into humanoid, but rather how this robotized factory came into being. So the point of this matter is the creation of the factory, or in other words, the creation of life from inorganic matter. The same applies to evolutionary concept of the origin of the universe. The question is not how the dot would evolve in complex universe, which would further create complex life. The question is how this dot came into being and had the ability to develop and create all these miracles we know without anyone's intervention. Therefore, the idea of evolution did not amount to any use in the search for origin of the universe, nor in the search of the source of life. However, the greatest weakness of the concept of spontaneous emergence of life from inanimate matter and its further spectacular development is this, that we do not record its key observations. There is no observation of any emergence of life from inanimate matter. Nobody has ever seen it. Such events are unobservable, therefore we cannot confirm as a fact that the first living organisms arose from inanimate matter. Second, we see on this second black box, we don't see such radical evolutionary changes as you would require. So there is no visible radical changes which transforms primitive organisms to advanced ones as a result of some natural processes. Certainly, somebody can say that radical evolutionary changes occur over a very long time period, during which the changes are not possible to observe for us. Okay, this is some argument for the lack of facts, but it is still a lack of facts. Especially observable changes related, for instance, to genetic mechanisms that maintain or use of existing protein functions rather than producing functionally new genes. Sometimes we say about new genes, which are actually copies of already existing genes. Someday I may try to explore that topic further. Now, let's assume there was the designer. We have reflected this at this green path, and observable brutal mechanisms of life and death have existed from the beginning, and so the struggle for existence, which is a factor that causes the transformation of life from very primitive to complex form. That is a typically evolutionary view, and designer planned all the processes, including origin of life from inanimate matter. Of course, immediately we find the same counter-arguments as for the red path, namely the lack of observations of the original flight from inanimate matter, so this point of view cannot be considered as a fact. And in a second black box, the lack of observation of such radical changes, the point of view cannot be considered as a fact. But the point is, from our point of view, the designer may have had bad intentions or created his design in inept manner. In both cases, the designer would by his nature be unjust, unmerciful, cruel, malicious, and wrathful. The question is whether we really want to even imagine such a designer in our conscious minds, let alone have any relationships with the designer such as hostile to us or with simply a bungler. In case of this concept, thinking logically and consistently, we may have a relationship with such a designer only due to fear or because we have decided ourselves to have a similar soulless attitude. For instance, counting on a possibility of cooperating and some temporary benefits. Then maybe yes. And besides, we probably wouldn't want to have much in common with such a designer.